India's energy mix and the role of gas. Speaking of energy and energy imports, India's oil imports in the United States have already jumped in January from the previous month, making the US now the fifth largest oil supplier according to data obtained by Reuters. India is looking to import more from the United States as it targets to boost energy purchases from about $15 billion last year to $25 billion, and more on that shortly. Meanwhile, while India's imports from Russia, which is now its top supplier, rose about 4.5% last month, it's likely to fall in coming months as there are heavy sanctions on Russian oil and the ships that ferry that oil. How those sanctions and other relations with Russia will play out in the next few months is not very clear, as the two, that's the United States and Russia, are now meeting in Saudi Arabia to find a solution to the Russian-Ukrainian war without either Ukraine or Europe in the room. So expect anything and everything. Meanwhile, the Reuters report also says that imports of Middle Eastern oil rose by about 6.5% in January, with Iraq continuing to be the second largest oil supplier to India, followed by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Meanwhile, India and Qatar, and more on that shortly, have said that they are doubling their trade to $28 billion in the next 5 years and are exploring the signing of a free trade agreement, according to the Indian Foreign Ministry on Tuesday. And this announcement came after talks between India's Prime Minister and Qatar's Emir, who is on a 2-day visit to New Delhi. So the overall share of Middle Eastern oil in India's crude imports in January stood at about a 2-year high of about 53%, while that of Russia remained almost stagnant from December, according to that data originally from Reuters. Now, India also stands to import more of it, that's LNG or liquefied natural gas from the United States. India's energy mix is about 6% represented by gas, but the government wants to take it up to 15%. That's quite a mighty battle and journey ahead. So where do we stand in our own journey in gas and gas consumption, and how could imports of US gas change that equation, if so, particularly since we may be forced to buy more from there? I reached out to Probal Sen, oil and gas analyst and vice president equity research at ICICI Securities, and first asked him to define India's gas needs, production and imports.
So India's overall gas consumption, put in terms of MMSCMD, which is essentially million standard cubic liters per day, is somewhere in the range of 195 to 200 MMSCMD. Today, it's actually neatly split between domestic and LNG, in the sense that domestic production is at close to 95 to 98 MMSCMD. And therefore, even LNG is basically in the range of around 90 to 95 MMSCMD. Put in terms of million tons, which is what sort of LNG gets traded in, that translates to somewhere around 26 million tons or so. Now, if you put it in global context, the global traded LNG last year was close to 370 million tons. So we are still a relatively smaller player when it comes to our import requirements. Japan, just to put things in context, imports close to 78 million tons on an annualized basis. China would be somewhere in that range, around 50 to 60 million tons. But having said that, India's demand is growing at a fairly fast clip. I think most estimates indicate that Indian gas consumption will probably grow by 8 to 10% a year, pretty much over the next decade or so. And considering the fact that there is simply not enough domestic production to make up for that supply, your requirements for LNG will keep growing at the rate of around 2 to 3 million tons pretty much every year. So that gets you in the range of somewhere around 35, 37 million tons in a very short period of time.
Per year. Right. So which means of 26 that you said, roughly 13 is domestically produced?
No. 26 million tons is the LNG that we import today. Domestic production converted to million tons is also around 25 million tons. In MMSCMD terms, both of these numbers are about 95 MMSCMD or so.
And in million tons?
In million tons, it's about 25 million tons, which is what India imports today in LNG.
And total India's LNG consumption, just to go over that figure again?
So India's overall gas consumption, including domestic and LNG, put in million metric standard cubic meters per day, is about 195 MMSCMD. Of this, around 95 odd MMSCMD is produced domestically by the likes of ONGC, Reliance, and Oil India and so on. The balance part, whatever is imported, all of it is imported in LNG form, because India doesn't have any importing gas pipelines, similar to, let's say, what Europe had with Russia before the conflict. India doesn't import anything through the pipeline route. All of its import are through LNG, which translates again to about 95 MMSCMD. Converted to million tons, this number translates to about 25 to 26 million tons as on date.
Right. And we have to import it in the form of LNG because you need specialized tankers, and that's how it comes in.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So that part's clear now. So now the Trump administration has just lifted a ban on exports of LNG. In our trade talks, America is telling India that you need to buy more energy from us. Presumably, a good part of that would be LNG. So, what is this adding up to?
I think it's important to put the Trump decision in context. What the Biden administration had done, I think last year, if I'm not mistaken, was to put a lot of new project approvals on hold. Now, there are still a significant amount of projects that are already in development that have not come on stream as yet. That itself is a very, very significant number. Today, if you look at it, the amount of liquefaction capacity globally is about 478 million tons or so, of which US alone accounts for almost 90 million tons. Now, if you look at the projects that are already approved, even during the Biden administration that had been approved earlier and are already in development, that number alone is close to 78 to 79 million tons. So the US, anyways, had a very clear and a robust pipeline of export projects that was there for the next 3 to 5 years. What the Trump decision actually does is to clear the pipeline for basically the period starting CY 27, 28, and beyond. Because what they had done by blocking export approvals for new projects, that would have meant that final investment decisions, or FIDs as they are called, which would have happened over 24, 25, and 26, those would have been held up, which is what the Trump administration has thankfully removed. So, therefore, from a slightly longer term perspective as well, there were about 150 to 200 million tons of projects that are basically in the approval or to be approved stage. A large part of that may actually see the light of day under this administration if they have their way over the next 4 years. And I think that means that in terms of sources of supply, the US can actually continue to become even bigger. They are already the biggest LNG exporter today globally. They have surpassed Qatar and Australia. And I think that lead will only grow more significantly over the next decade or so. So, from an Indian standpoint, to answer your second question, one of the articles that I read recently stated that given the kind of tit for tat tariffs that are slated to be imposed, India will probably need to cool the heat down by importing an equivalent amount of energy, since the US is a large destination for some of our refined product exports and other exports. And therefore, to bridge that trade deficit, the secretary was quoted as saying that, we would look to increase our energy imports by as much as $10 billion. We import about 15 billion of energy imports already. About $10 billion more is sought to be imported. Now, if I were to translate that in terms of volumes, 5 million tons of LNG at a $10 price roughly would translate to about 2.5 to $2.7 billion. And about zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.3 million barrels of oil per day would translate to another 5.5 billion. So I honestly don't know what combination India is looking at, but I guess given our requirements, as I just stated, I think that would probably be the direction they would take in terms of redressing this trade balance that the US is also aiming for.
Right. And LNG, particularly, is a little unusual because most contracts are long term. We've just signed another one with Qatar, from whom we were importing substantial amounts. So we are at about 6% of energy consumption in gas and wanting to, of course, go to 15. How do you think this gap could be addressed, or will we have to shift or break contracts, or how could that work?
No. I think, as I said, the kind of requirements that we have within this 25 million tons that I mentioned earlier, in terms of what we today consume in the form of LNG, there is a fair proportion of gas which we import on spot basis, which is to say that we import it from the short term Asian markets. In the region, I think if I look at the term contracts that are in place, you would have probably 3 to 4 million tons already that would be imported on short term basis. So, given that this demand will continue to increase, as I said, over the next 5 to 7 years, if we have another 7, 8 million tons of effective demand, we can obviously look to tie up import contracts with a whole lot of destinations. It could be 3 to 4 million from the US, another 2 to 3 million tons from Qatar, as is being sought. You could even have fresh contracts from Mozambique, as and when it starts up, given that India has a big ownership of one of the large projects there. If and when that project starts up, you could have some projects tied up from there. See, India as an energy market is never a market of this or this. India as a market is essentially, I will take this and this and this. So to that extent, whatever source we can actually target and tie up gas from, yes, there could be a mismatch here and there for a short period of time. But I don't think that tying up more cargoes from the US is necessarily a threat to other long-term contracts that we are targeting from the Middle East.
Got it. And again, this is for someone who's trying to understand. So, if gas is coming from the US versus Qatar, obviously it's traveling a longer distance. Does that affect prices or is that entirely market determined at that point of time?
Let me just give you an example of what the prices are today. Even today, we have contracts from Qatar and we have contracts from the US, right? GAIL already has about 5.8 million tons coming through, which is benchmarked to US Henry Hub prices, whereas Qatar's contracts are tied to Brent prices or an Indian basket of crude and a certain percentage is attached to that. If I were to compare the prices today, even today, at $75 crude, the price of long-term cargoes from Qatar is somewhere in the range of around $9.50 or so. At a very rough estimate, I'm telling you. And similarly, on a Henry Hub base price of $3.50, the contract that was with tied up first with Cheniere, which was essentially 115% of your base Henry Hub price, plus about $3 of margins, and then you add on freight, insurance, and transport, that translates to about $9.2 as well. So it really depends on what kind of pricing formula is really agreed to with whatever contracts we're signing. Otherwise, I think US cargoes, thanks to the huge differential of their basic Henry Hub price versus, LNG prices in Asia, they end up being fairly competitive to any cargo that is available.
As a buyer to us, whether it's coming all the way from the US or from next door in Qatar or Australia on the other side, is really not, it's really market determined, the price. Not the distance or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about what you can negotiate in terms of the benchmark and the pricing formula, because this is never a fixed price contract. LNG contracts are almost always based on a percentage of a certain benchmark. And that benchmark itself, as you rightly mentioned, is a function of the market. If you have a Brent linked benchmark, you have no clue what Brent is going to do. But all you can do is basically try and see if the percentage to Brent is not excessive. And similar would be the case for a benchmark which is linked to, let's say, US Henry Hub prices, which is a function of what US domestic markets are doing, how their gas production is doing, and so on and so forth.
Got it. Last question. In a very general sense, as we import more LNG or for that matter, even produce more LNG, what is our ability to absorb that input and production, in particularly from a distribution point of view?
Okay, so that question has two parts, if I can take a minute. One is, of course, whether we have the import capacity. And I think that question is relatively easy to answer. India has a huge amount of surplus LNG import capacity that is sitting there. As I said, about 25, 26 million ton is the total LNG import today. As opposed to that, just Petronet LNG alone has, close to about 22 million tons of capacity, and it is getting expanded by a further 5 million tons by the end of this financial year. You've got HPCL, which has a 5 million ton plant. You've got IOCL, which has set up a plant. So India's total import capacity is, I think, going to be around 45 to 48 million tons by the end of this year. That's on the import infrastructure. To answer your second part, which is distribution infrastructure, when that gas comes in, whether there is enough gas connectivity, I think GAIL has been expanding India's gas transmission network fairly steadily. In the rest of India, GSPL has been expanding and does have plans to connect some of the newer terminals as well to the state of Gujarat and then onto the national grid. And the eastern part of the country is also now connected. That part, in terms of infrastructure, that is not a constraint. What will be interesting is, given that India is a price-sensitive market, if gradually we move from today's mix of 50-50 domestic and LNG to maybe about 70-30, which is what is likely over the next 5 to 7 years, can the Indian market absorb pricing of $9 plus on a blended basis, and how much demand there still is at that price? I think that will probably be a more important monitorable over the next 5 to 7 years.
Got it. Prabal, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.